and changes rivers into storm sewers. But the damage can be reversed.
You want them on or off? Off.
This is human habitat. Already more than 3/4 of us here in North America live in cities. And by the end of this decade, half of all human beings on Earth will be city dwellers. Like it or not, we're an urban species now. And that has major implications for us and for many other forms of life. Rapidly growing cities can be a devastating force, sprawling over land, destroying everything in their path, and creating impoverished environments for their inhabitants. But it doesn't have to be like that. Right now in cities across North America, people are rethinking the way we occupy space and redesigning the urban landscape. Clean, efficient, modern cities. That's the illusion. The reality is a mess, a crisis of accumulated waste that proves difficult to deal with.
Put your garbage on the curb and it's gone. We don't know what is happening. We don't realize that our landfill sites are almost full and we don't have anywhere else to go.
Urban waterways are filthy beyond belief. Member of Parliament, Dennis Mills.
We're talking about the most polluted river in Canada. We're talking about a chemical cauldron here filled with toxic and biological waste, where when you first look at it, people say, that's impossible.
I think it's disgusting. I think people should be educated and should know that dumping things into water affects the whole ecosystem around it.
In the city, air is a dumping ground, as well as land and water. As cities expand, pushing out into the natural places around them, they destroy the very things they depend on for survival. This urban landscape, rolled out across North America, replaces natural processes with engineering, flattening the land, piping the water in and out. But beneath the maze, the living earth survives, the city's past and its future.
The general idea of urban dwellers is that they live in some sort of disconnected spaceship that's hovering above the earth. You get this when you ask city dwellers where their water comes from, and they say the faucet, or where the garbage goes, and they say out, or where the food comes from, and they say the grocery store. That's the comment of a person that thinks of himself as a component of a system, where the warm part that plugs in to the systems. Whereas in fact, cities are all on the terrain of some bioregion or other. Bioregion meaning a place that is alive.
Look at any city that way, and you'll see its lifeblood flowing. Fouled and imprisoned, rivers still make their ancient journey from the source. Everywhere, nature refuses to be pushed aside. Water and growth break down the concrete barriers, defeating the engineers' efforts to contain them. In city parks, people are drawn by water into a different world, tidied up, but still alive. The highway shoots straight across the valley. Down below, fresh water and fertile land, the reasons people came here in the first place. Now, the city has taken over. But the living place is still there, hanging on, hidden beneath the present moment. It's lodged in geography and natural history, in the lie of the land. We live in geography, on land carved by ice and water, in watersheds, fitted inside each other like a nest of cups. The Great Lakes watershed is home to 35 million of us, but within it are smaller places, communities defined by local conditions. Take the city of Toronto on Lake Ontario's North Shore. It's built on a coastal plain crisscrossed by creeks and rivers. To the north is the insignificant little natural feature that shapes the region's life. The Oak Ridges Moraine. It's an area of rolling hills running 160 kilometers along the shoreline of Lake Ontario, dotted with old towns, farmland, and new subdivisions. Within spitting distance of the city, pockets of the original forest cover remain. In their shelter, life acts out the age-old rituals every spring, finding a place to live and then defending it. Long ago, a glacier buried a boulder of ice here. As it melted, it created this lake. Folds and wrinkles at the surface reveal the region's history. This is a moraine, a gigantic heap of sand and gravel washed off the continental glacier as it melted 10,000 years ago. In some places, the gravel is 100 meters deep. A thin layer of soil covers the whole moraine. This band of rubble across the top of the city gives life to the whole region. Hardwood trees are tapped into its groundwater, rooted deep in the gravel. They build soil and create habitat for other forms of life. It's a community of magnificent variety, shaped by and for this particular place, these unique conditions. Everything here depends on everything else. The expanding city takes these relationships apart, changing the way things work right across the watershed. When the trees are removed, water runs off the surface instead of sinking in, and it takes the topsoil with it. Soil from right here can end up clogging waterways and river mouths many kilometers away. Land that's been graded to dry it out can't support much life anymore. Last year, there was a wetland here. Today, the goose must find another home. When it rains, the moraine acts like a gigantic sponge. First, the trees absorb the water. Then they release it slowly into the porous soil. Filtered and purified by the gravel, it percolates down into immense natural reservoirs underground. This groundwater supplies the whole watershed. Along the hillsides, bubbling out through the glacial sand, stored rainwater re-emerges. Countless little streams tumble down towards Lake Ontario. Turbulence draws oxygen into their cool, clean water, and they're filled with life. But there's no place here for unnatural watercourse. Captured at the city's edge, each stream is redesigned. Deprived of oxygen, separated from the soil, it's condemned to death. The lifeless water channeled swiftly through the city. Water that isn't piped away is also at risk from urban expansion. These houses have been built on moraine wetlands, and their septic systems are leaking into the groundwater. The new owner is cutting back the marshes that remain around his property. They're starting to smell of sewage. What seeps in here may come out somewhere else. As the old towns on the moraine expand into commuter dormitories, the water they've relied on for generations is doubly threatened. Demand is rising fast, and so is the risk of contamination. Water quality is one of the concerns of a former mayor of Toronto who's just completed a study of land use in Ontario. John Sewell.
Oh, we ought to be really, really worried about the quality of our groundwater. I mean, one of the things we know on the fringes of Toronto, groundwater is being polluted by sewage. And we're actually putting in place sewage arrangements that in fact are polluting the water so you can't drink it. And you can't use it in any reasonable way. And there's two ways we're doing that. One is through the indiscriminate use of the septic system, which wasn't designed for the kinds of urban uses that it's now getting. And secondly, by building sewage treatment plants that don't quite work. I mean, the figure for southern Ontario is that sewage treatment plants treat about 75% of the sewage that's headed toward them. The other 25% just goes into rivers or lakes. It's very, very scary.
Around North America, most city sewage is only partly treated. Our technology can't deal with many common ingredients in the mix, like toxic chemicals or heavy metals. And very often, there's just too much sewage to treat. This is where the overflow goes. Handy little pipes turn the creek in the park into an extension of the sewage system every time it rains. There's nothing natural about the way water is dealt with in the city. When it rains, it doesn't soak in as it does on the moraine. Here, the ground sheds rainwater instead of filtering it. Running off oil-soaked asphalt down grimy gutters, it carries the city's dirt into the storm sewers. They're rooted out into urban waterways. When storm and sanitary sewers are combined, raw sewage floods the creek. As the storm ends, bushes beside the sewage outfall blossom with urban flowers. This is how we've engineered the creeks we live beside. I spoke to ecologist Alexander Wilson.
So basically we're walking along the bottom of a creek.
That's right, a concrete bottom. Doesn't leave much room for aquatic life or any life along the shoreline. It's a creek in a cascade. Really, it's an engineer's idea of what a creek might be. If a creek is understood as a way of conveying water away as quickly as possible, water then becomes a nuisance rather than the fountain of life that sustains all of us. I mean, is this any place for kids to come and wade and look for frogs and that kind of thing? Obviously not. And I think a lot of people miss that in their lives, especially in cities. People want nature. People want natural areas in cities.
You know, I think I've been as guilty as anyone of essentially regarding cities as ecological black holes that suck resources in but don't return much back to the planet. But that really is a very kind of negative, pessimistic view, isn't it?
I think it's a mistake. Politically, it's a dead end because most of us live in cities after all. And if nature is only something that's exotic, if it's a Banff National Park or an Algonquin Park that we have to drive in our cars 3 hours to get to, I think that's it's an unecological idea in the first place because those places have been long influenced by human activities and land use patterns and resource extraction and so on. But it also puts nature, the rest of nature, I should say, at a great distance from us. And I think we want it here in our lives. People want it in their gardens and backyards and parks.
Former Toronto Mayor David Crombie agrees.
Nature is fundamental to cities. I mean, cities are a part of nature. They're not separate from it. They're like all human beings, they're a part of nature. So when I walk through the city, and I think most people who are city lovers, when they walk through a city, they see trees and they see the terrain and they see little animals and they see birds, they see fish and wildlife habitat, they see creeks and rivers. They're all parts of cities.
David Crombie headed the Royal Commission on the Future of the Toronto Waterfront. In it, he takes what's called the ecosystem approach. It's an old idea, really, but if acted upon, it will revolutionize the way we plan our cities.
First of all, it starts off with the principle that everything is connected to everything else. Secondly, it says that human beings are part of nature and not separate from it. And thirdly, if you take the first two, thirdly, it says that therefore, we have an obligation to ourselves, to other generations, to other species. Now, that's the fundamentals. Those are the fundamentals, the fundamental principles of the ecosystem approach. I can apply it to cities, I can apply it to Baffin Island, I can apply it to a village, I can apply it to a creek. Anywhere human beings are is where you find the necessity of the ecosystem approach.
It's the route to renewing the city, a way of understanding that what we do has its effects all around us, in the living natural system we're part of. The engineered solutions we've always used, separating and trying to control little bits of things, got us into this mess. But if we could see ourselves as part of an ecosystem, part of a place made up of land, water, air, living organisms, and the relationships among them, then we could begin to transform our cities. Nature's ready and waiting. The place is still alive. And there's a movement afoot. Everywhere, people are starting to reconnect with the world around them.
This is the first fast forward. It's gonna happen
When
2
we
times.
return, resurrecting a river left for dead.
It didn't take long.
Restoring the living city begins with seeing places differently. This green desert was once an active part of the watershed. Planting trees will help Riverdale Park become a river valley again. But the Citizens Coalition working to rehabilitate the lower Don River first had to deal with the boundary lines human beings draw across natural features. Legal and bureaucratic barriers made it tough just to plant a few trees. Mark Wilson from the task force to bring back the Don.
There are so many different overlapping jurisdictions amongst the municipal, federal, and provincial government departments that it's difficult, in fact, to get change going. One of the reasons our group has been successful is that we sort of operate slightly outside the official boundaries, and we're able to, in fact, bring different groups of people together, cutting across jurisdictions. I don't think tree planting today is a revolution, but it's a statement of commitment, and it's an actual commitment that people are making. There are other kinds of acts we can make that are, in fact, perhaps more revolutionary, particularly in the Don Valley. One of our objectives is to bring a large marsh back to the mouth of the Don, which is today industrial land. That will be a revolutionary act, and we will do it.
It'll take a revolution to resurrect the lower Don from its concrete coffin. This whole area has been created by city engineers over the last century, dumping fill into Lake Ontario to make land for industry, and getting the Don under control. The river has lost its natural course, and with it, the energy that might flush its channel clean. It's not a pretty sight. There used to be better things to see along the Don. The Don Valley has been a place to play within living memory. But long before this picture was snapped, the river's life support systems were in jeopardy. The great marsh at its mouth had always been a destination for migrating waterfowl, a native hunting ground. Then a century ago, it was filled in and used for industrial storage. But you can't change reality as easily as that. The marsh has always lurked just below the surface, doing what comes naturally, soaking up everything in sight. Today, the ground is saturated with a witch's brew of toxic residues. Places like this are the consequence of ordinary carelessness and ignorance, according to Suzanne Barrett of the Royal Commission on Toronto's waterfront.
People were not aware of the environmental consequences of what they were doing. People didn't think about whether they were spilling oil, whether they were being careless. They didn't think about the metals from the scrap heaps and what was happening to them as they hit the ground and were left in place for very many years. Some contaminants get attached to the soil particles and become part of the soil itself. And some go into the groundwater and dissolve in it and can move in the groundwater underneath the soil into Lake Ontario. It's very difficult to know how much it's going to cost to clean up the land in the Port District because we don't even know what techniques are most appropriate for cleaning up the soils.
Pilot projects are being tested. Larger chunks of garbage are mechanically separated. A small sewage treatment plant attacks oils and greases, while experimental systems try to strip out heavy metals. Technology like this takes time to develop, and a lot of money. But while that's happening, natural forces could be put to work. Bob Newberry is a hydrologist working on the Don River.
Well, the soil in here, because of this man-made landfill again, is so badly polluted that we really can't afford to have any of this eroded away. This is going to have to sit in a vault for a long time until we have either the technology or the money or the knowledge to know what to do with it. Right now, about the best we can do would be to cover it with some new sediments, see if we couldn't get some marsh growing again, marsh plants growing in here to strip off a few of these nutrients. But really, it's a short-term solution. In the long term, we're still going to have to cope with this inheritance of rubbish that we put down here for the last 80 years.
This land is worse than worthless. We don't know yet what we'll have to pay to clean it up. Cities all over the world are discovering the cost of ignoring nature. Further up